Well, good evening everyone and welcome to Temenos, and congratulations on braving the storm this evening. I will first light our Temenos candle and dedicate it to all followers of Plato. It's my particular pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening, Andrew Baker. Andrew is a composer, filmmaker, and intrepid researcher of the history of Shugborough, that perfect example of the English country house, ancestral seat of the Earls of Lichfield, set in the heart of England, close to Cannock Chase. I think of him as the destined, if unofficial, guardian of the place, with as Arcadian setting bounded by the waters of the River Sow, and made famous by the mysterious Shepherd's Monument, a bas-relief in marble based on Poussin's Et in Arcadia Ego. Over many years of original and meticulous research, Andrew has pursued the circle of architects, artists, poets, musicians and philosophers associated both with Shugborough and with the Greek revival. We tend to think of this cultural movement, which emerged most strongly in the mid-18th century, in the material terms of architecture and decor. But what Andrew has discovered is what has been overlooked or downplayed: its importance in the history of ideas, specifically in the revival of Platonism, a moment in which the underground stream of the perennial philosophy bubbled up to the surface to inspire this remarkable group of gifted individuals, centred on Thomas Anson, owner of the estate, who Andrew describes as a secretive patron of the arts. Many years of historical detective work have culminated in a book-length study of this fascinating story, which Andrew has now posted most generously online. But he has served Shugborough in another way, by bringing back the muses. His symphonies, sonatas and string quartets are regularly performed there. These are also accessible online, often accompanied by beautiful photographic essays of the surrounding landscape celebrating the spirit of place. The combination of music and nature invokes the experience of a walking meditation. His latest film, inspired by the mystical medieval poem Pearl, takes place in an enchanted garden where the young man converses with the shining maiden, their roles touchingly performed by marionettes. This theme of conversing on deep things in an earthly paradise applies equally to the subject of Andrew's talk to us this evening, Conversations in Arcadia. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that introduction. And I have to say that this is my first and perhaps only ever time addressing the Temenos Academy, and it's an enormous honour because I've been following the work of Temenos for 20 years, I would say. I've got all the books. And the work of this academy covers every possible subject I could be interested in that touches on this general field, which is the perennial philosophy, and in this case particularly the influence of Plato. So, this is a scripted performance because I have to keep all the information in its place, and I will try and avoid going off on rambling digressions. But it's worth telling you that it's in 4 movements. It begins with an overture, which is about my own background researching Shugborough, which has a bit more of the thriller approach to it. But then it settles down to a duet with variations, which is the substantial business of the philosophers James Harris and Floyer Sydenham. And nearly everything I will tell you about Floyer Sydenham is totally unknown to anybody, apart from me so far. And then there is an intermezzo with Pudding's and a brief epilogue. So, that's the form of it. Right. Number 1, the overture. Just get my buttons. Uh-huh. To a lover of Plato, 18th century England was a time of philosophical darkness. God, or truth, had been quite separated from a material creation which turned as if by clockwork. Pat Rogers' introduction to the 18th century, that is before William Blake, in Platonism and the English Imagination, is a mere 5 pages long. At the end of the century, light was shared into the darkness when Thomas Taylor revived interest in Plato and his followers. Taylor wrote in 1792, "Materialism and its attendant sensuality have darkened the eyes of the many with mists of error. Impetuous ignorance is thundering at the bulwarks of philosophy, and her sacred retreats are in danger of being demolished. Rise then, my friends, and the victory will be ours." That's Thomas Taylor. His undoubted importance has been celebrated by Kathleen Raine, founder of the Temenos Academy, as she wrote, "The Platonic tradition may be likened to an underground river that from time to time sends up a spring. Wherever its waters flow, the soul is reborn." Her collection of Taylor's writings showed his importance in reviving that tradition for the 19th century. But throughout the 18th century, a forgotten circle of Platonists was at work. A small, closely knit group of patrons, artists, and philosophers who saw the dangers of materialism long before Taylor. These quiet revolutionaries have been largely forgotten, but they left visible and material traces in the architecture and gardens of the Greek revival. I was drawn into these mysteries of 18th century history by the enigmatic figure of Thomas Anson, 1695 to 1773. From the late 1740s to his death in 1773, Thomas Anson developed his estate at Shugborough, Staffordshire. The first stage, in 1748, working with the cosmologist and architect Thomas Wright, the addition of a library and drawing room to his house, you'll see on the left and right wings of the original Queen Anne house there, transformed the house into a philosophical gentleman's villa. The library is a comfortable place for study. Athene decorates the ceiling, surrounded by poets and philosophers. Socrates, Plato, Euclid, Sappho. The drawing room has large Capricci paintings, fantasies of antiquity, and the ceiling of the drawing room shows Guido Reni's Apollo and the Hours. And uniquely, on the 4 sides of the room, there are roundels which show Isis and Serapis. That's Isis just there. She's holding a sistrum, her symbol. And there's a Maenad, and also above the window, rather unusually, Confucius, who represents Thomas's brother George Anson's visit to China on his circumnavigation of the globe in the 1740s. The second stage of the developments at Shugborough was a series of buildings by James Athenian Stewart. In 1755, Stewart and Nicholas Rivette returned from a dangerous 7-year adventure in Greece with a treasure of architectural drawings. The first volume of their Antiquities of Athens appeared in 1762. This was, according to Kathleen Raine, the most important single work in inspiring a passion for things Greek. By that time, the first buildings inspired by the work had already been built. For the first time, architects in England were able to celebrate the ideals of ancient Greece in stone. Shugborough became a showcase for Stewart's Greek designs. That's the Tower of the Winds and the Arch of Hadrian. These monuments have long been seen as the reason for Shugborough's historical importance. But until this century, and I mean the 21st century, the key role of Thomas Anson in the Greek revival hadn't been recognised. The credit for the first building in the authentic Greek style has long been given to the Doric temple designed by Stuart for Lord Lyttelton at Hagley, Worcestershire. J. Mordaunt Crook wrote in 1968, "The Greek revival in British architecture, indeed the Greek revival anywhere in the world, began symbolically in 1758-9 with the Doric landscape temple at Hagley. That date is sacrosanct." George Lyttelton, that's Lord Lyttelton, his estate at Hagley was certainly an influential landscape. He was known as a man of taste. Lyttelton had been secretary to Frederick, Prince of Wales, and one of the group of Whigs who opposed Robert Walpole and King George II. In the 1740s, he was the patron of the poet James Thomson, author of The Seasons and Rule Britannia, which comes from a masque in honour of Frederick. Thomson's poem, The Castle of Indolence, of 1748, actually praises Hagley and includes a few lines actually by Lord Lyttelton. The poem, The Castle of Indolence, invokes the three great landscape painters of the 17th century whose classical scenes were already inspiring the English landscape estates. Thomson wrote, "Whate'er Lorraine light touched with softening hue, or savage Rosa dashed, or learned Poussin drew." These are the great inferences on the style of English gardens at that period. For a very long time, I'd had a suspicion that Thomas Anson of Shugborough had been a key figure in something that was far more than a movement of architectural style and taste, more of an underground stream of influential ideas. It had always seemed disappointing to me that Hagley, rather than Shugborough, had been seen as the starting point of the Greek revival in the arts. But my suspicion proved true. Since 2000, historians have rediscovered Thomas Anson's role in promoting Stuart's career and the new Grecian taste. Historian Kerry Bristol told me of a letter from Lord Lyttelton at Hagley to the leading lady of the Blue Stockings, Elizabeth Montagu, written in October 1758. This is Lord Lyttelton writing to Elizabeth Montagu. "Mr. Anson and Mr. Stuart, who were with me last week, are true lovers of Hagley, but their delight in it was disturbed by a blustering wind which gave them colds and little chilled their imagination itself. Yet Stuart seems almost as fond of my vale as of the Thessala Tempe. He is going to embellish one of the hills with a true Attic building, a portico of 6 pillars, which will make a fine effect to my new house and command a most beautiful view of the country." There is a philosophical meaning to even just a simple temple like this. A temple like Lyttelton's is not an expression of grandeur or imperial power, as any building might be which is inspired by Rome. Such a temple is an expression of purity and simplicity, a piece which might command a most beautiful view, and from which one might contemplate nature. This is the great difference between the Roman style and the Greek style. Thomas Anson's copy of the Doric temple dates from a year or so later than the Hagley original. But it now appears, from Lyttelton's letter, that Anson had become Stuart's patron as soon as the architect returned from Greece in 1755, and by 1758 it was Anson who was introducing Stuart to Lyttelton and thus causing the sacrosanct first building of the Greek revival to happen. The earliest surviving structure, though, of the architectural Greek revival is not in fact the Hagley Temple, but Stuart's additional edicule, that is the outer arch, of the Shepherd's Monument, the heart of Thomas Anson's garden at Shugborough. Greville Lindop, in his Shugborough Eclogues, calls the Shepherd's Monument the garden's secret door. The monument frames a marble relief by shoemakers of Poussin's Shepherds of Arcadia. The original monument was built before 1750 as part of the original scheme of house and garden which Thomas Anson developed with Thomas Wright. It would have looked something like this design from Thomas Wright's book of designs for arbours and grottos. Stuart's edicule was added in about 1756 to protect the relief. This was 3 years before the Hagley Temple was built, and a very short time after Stuart had returned from his travels in Greece. So this is really the key building of this movement of ideas and style. The relief is a mirror image of Poussin's painting, and it's copied from an engraving. The Shepherds of Arcadia have found a tomb. Death is present even in this ideal world. But the shepherdess on the left here, because it's a mirror image made from an engraving which would be engraved and printed in reverse, she's serene as if she knows higher truths which transcend death. Oh, sorry. It's the buttons. The Shepherd's Monument, therefore, this is the Poussin original, with the shepherdess on the right. This brings together all the themes and mysteries of the Arcadian dream. If, as I believed, Thomas Anson was the prime mover of a hidden philosophical movement of which the Greek revival in architecture was just a physical sign, what were his motives and what was his inspiration? He's a man of mystery. There's amazingly little personal information about Thomas Anson. But in the last few years, new information has been coming to light, always fragmentary, and all of it significant and revealing. In 2005, when I was composer in residence at Shugborough, I had no idea that in his old age Anson had held concerts with the finest and most expensive musicians at his new London house, also designed by Stuart, 15 St James Square. It's recently been sold, but I couldn't really run to buying it, it's a pity. There are references to his concerts in a massive and important study published in 2002, Music and Theatre in Handel's World, The Family Papers of James Harris, 1732 to 1780, edited by Donald Burrows and Rosemary Dunhill. James Harris was new to me. Now, this is James Harris. He was MP for Christchurch, a close friend of Handel, and for 50 years organiser of the music festival at Salisbury. I was delighted and taken aback to discover that Harris, who was my main source for Thomas Anson's musical activities, was also the one Platonist philosopher who actually made any kind of impact in England in the middle of the 18th century. It seemed too good to be true. Thomas Anson had at least a musical link with this philosopher who kept the flame of Platonism burning. And this is the wonders of Google. Sometime around 10 years ago, a simple Google search brought up an astonishing clue. This is simply Googling James Harris and Thomas Anson. Is there a connection? This is James Harris in his last book, Philological Inquiries, published posthumously in 1781, recording something Thomas Anson must have told him many years earlier. I'll read the whole anecdote. When the late Mr. Anson, Lord Anson's brother, was upon his travels in the East, he hired a vessel to visit the Isle of Tenedos. His pilot, an old Greek, as they were sailing along, said with some satisfaction, "There 'twas our fleet lay." Mr. Anson demanded, "What fleet?" "What fleet?" replied the old man, and I'm trying to avoid doing a Greek accent here. A little piqued at the question, "Why, our Grecian fleet at the siege of Troy." The story was told the author by Mr. Anson himself. Now, this trip to Temenos with the Old Greek can be dated 1734. This is 25 years before the Hagley Temple, 5 years before Lord Sandwich and Francis Dashwood made adventurous journeys to the east. And here is Thomas Anson in contact with the very roots of Greek culture. Sandwich and Dashwood publicised their adventures, but this is the only record of Anson's expedition, apart from a letter in... I've forgotten the word. There's a letter, anyway, a letter of recommendation in the archives which proves the date. And that is the only other evidence of this tour, but it must have been a several years' journey around the east in 1734. But in 1750, a visitor wrote a poem in Thomas's Anson, A Visitor to Chagres, which implied that he'd also been at Athens. It refers to Minerva's fane by the river Ilissus. A few years later, in 1741, Thomas Anson toured the Mediterranean and seems to have been in the ruins of Palmyra and Baalbek. And his house and garden became a private theatre of memory, recording the ruins of past civilizations and lost wisdom. In his later years, Anson's platonic focus was the pursuit of ideal beauty in his sculpture collection. Another anonymous poem describing the house mentions the miracles of Grecian art in living sculptures, godlike shapes and forms excelling humour. The botanist Joseph Banks visited Chagres in 1769. His diary describes Thomas showing him the beauties of a statue of Adonis by candlelight. The statue has gone, but this is a watercolour of it in its niche. "There's a grace, sir. Believe me, the Venus of Medicis is clumsy to it," said Thomas. Having said this, Banks wrote, "he retired and left me to my contemplations." To these enthusiasts for the wisdom of Greece in a dark materialist 18th century, truth, beauty and virtue were serious matters. Thomas Anson remains mysterious, an invisible patron, but the philosophers of this quiet Platonic revolution left their testaments, some unread, some unpublished.